I am Harrison. I am 35 years old. In a single Tuesday afternoon, my wife of 12 years filed for divorce, and my new boss fired me to make room for his own agenda. While I was packing my life into a cardboard box, my wife looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're worthless, Harrison. I'm not spending the rest of my life waiting for a man who peaked at warehouse management. I'm taking the kids." She laughed with her parents, right there in my own driveway, as they loaded my children into her SUV like I was nothing but a minor inconvenience. But there is one thing they didn't know. The broken old man I met in a diner that night was not just a grieving father. He was a billionaire looking for an heir. And right now, my ex-wife and her lover are facing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and begging for my mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from them, hit that like button if you believe in karma. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the day my life completely shattered. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp, ordinary October morning where you think your biggest problem is the traffic on the interstate. I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room on the third floor of Meridian Logistics. I had given 12 years of my life to that company. I started there loading delivery trucks on the graveyard shift when I was 23. My hands were permanently calloused from those early years. I worked my way up, blood, sweat, and missed holidays, to regional operations manager. I missed Thanksgiving dinners with my family. I skipped summer weekends. I put off vacations just to make sure the supply chain kept moving and the holiday quotas were met. I did it all to build a solid, dependable salary, to pay the mortgage on a nice suburban house, and to build a college fund for my two kids, Preston, who is 8, and Clara, who is 5. Sitting across from me was a man named Julian. He was 32, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, a Rolex that cost more than my first car, and a haircut that screamed corporate privilege. He was the new vice president of operations, brought in from the parent company after a corporate merger 6 months prior. Julian had this slick, unearned confidence, the kind of guy who had never touched a cardboard box in his life but was now in charge of thousands of them. He looked at me, slid a manila folder across the mahogany table, and folded his perfectly manicured hands. He told me the restructuring was complete. He told me my position was eliminated. He made sure to emphasize, with a sickeningly polite tone, that my performance was perfectly fine. I had excellent reviews. But the company needed a leaner management structure for operational efficiency. Effective immediately. No transition period. Human Resources was waiting outside to escort me to my desk to collect my things. 12 years of loyalty, 12 years of answering emails at 3 in the morning, erased in a 3-minute meeting. I stared at him, my stomach dropping into my shoes. I asked about my severance, assuming my tenure would buy me at least a few months to land on my feet. Julian smiled a thin, corporate smile and told me I would get 6 weeks of pay and standard Cobra health benefits through the end of the month. That was it. I packed my framed photo of Preston and Clara in their Halloween costumes, a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Dad," and a few pens into a brown cardboard box. 2 HR reps walked me to the parking lot and took my security badge. They didn't even shake my hand. I sat in my Honda in the parking lot for an hour. I did not cry. I just felt a crushing weight on my chest, a total system failure of my identity. My primary identity as a provider, a husband, a working man was gone. How was I going to pay the mortgage? How was I going to look my wife, Valerie, in the eye and tell her I had failed? I drove back to our house. It was a nice neighborhood, complete with a strict HOA, manicured lawns, and neighbors who measured your worth by the badge on your car's grill. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Valerie's car. I also saw her parents' luxury sedan parked right behind it. Richard and Martha, my in-laws. I walked through the front door, carrying my pathetic cardboard box, my heart heavy with the bad news I was about to deliver. But the living room was already half empty. Valerie was taping up a moving box in the center of the rug. Richard was standing by the fireplace, checking his expensive watch, while Martha was folding Clara's winter coats into a duffel bag. I asked what was going on. Valerie stopped taping the box. She stood up, crossed her arms, and looked at me with a coldness I had never seen before. She didn't look surprised to see me home early. She just looked annoyed. She told me she was filing for divorce. I dropped the box. My kid's framed photo shattered on the hardwood floor, glass scattering across the wood. I told her I just got laid off, that I needed a minute, that we needed to figure this out together. Valerie did not flinch. She stepped over the broken glass. She told me she already knew about the layoffs. In fact, she had been consulting a divorce lawyer for months. She said my sudden lack of income actually simplified the financial division. Her lawyer said it was the ideal time to file, because the alimony and child support calculations would be infinitely more favorable to her while I was technically unemployed. I asked her why. After 12 years, after building a life, a home, a family, why was she tearing it down on the exact day I lost my livelihood? That is when she delivered the line that will echo in my head until the day I die. She called me worthless. She said I had never been ambitious enough, that my salary was a joke compared to the people she grew up with, and she was done waiting for a man who peaked at warehouse management to figure out who he is. Richard chimed in, telling me I should have gone into commercial real estate like he advised 10 years ago. Martha just shook her head in disgust, muttering that I had always been a disappointment. Valerie told me she was taking Preston and Clara to her parents' house. The kids were already in the backyard. She opened the patio door and called them in. Preston looked confused, his little hands clutching a toy truck. Clara was crying because she felt the tension in the room. I tried to kneel down and hug them, but Richard stepped between us. He put his hand on my chest and shoved me back. He told me not to make a scene and traumatize the children. I stood frozen on the porch as they loaded my kids into the SUV. I watched their taillights disappear down the street. The silence of the empty house was deafening. Everything I loved, everything I worked for, vanished in a span of 4 hours. By 10 that night, the walls of that house were suffocating me. I got in my car and drove aimlessly through the pouring rain, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. I ended up at a 24-hour place called the Peony Diner, a greasy spoon with flickering neon lights in the window. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the back. A waitress named Beatrice, who looked like she had been working there since the 80s, poured me a cup of black coffee. She did not ask how I was doing. She just gave me a sympathetic nod, set the pot down, and told me to take all the time I needed. I was staring out the window at the rain when the front door chimed. An old man walked in. He was wearing a faded brown corduroy jacket. He had silver hair, a slight stoop, and deep lines of sorrow carved into his face. He ordered a slice of cherry pie at the counter. As he turned to find a seat, his eyes locked onto me. He stopped completely. His right foot hovered in the air. His hand gripped the edge of a chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He turned completely pale, the color draining from his face like he had just seen a phantom. He walked slowly toward my booth, ignoring his usual seat at the counter. He sat down across from me without asking permission. He was shaking violently. I asked him if he was okay, if he needed me to call someone. He stared at my face. He tried to speak, choked on the words, and tried again. He told me I looked exactly like his son. Then his voice cracked, barely a whisper over the diner's old jukebox. He said his son had been missing for 30 years. I did not know what to say. The man reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn, leather wallet, and took out a photograph that had been laminated and relaminated over decades. He slid it across the table. I looked at the picture. It was a young man in his early 20s, standing in front of a brick college building. The jawline, the eyes, the slight crookedness of the nose. It was not just a resemblance. It was a mirror. If you aged that kid in the photo by 10 years, put him in my cheap suit, and added the dark circles under my eyes, you would be looking at my reflection. I stared at the photo, completely speechless, as the old man leaned forward, about to utter the words that would alter the trajectory of my entire existence. The old man introduced himself as Silas. I told him my name was Harrison. I assured him, gently, that I was not his missing son. I told him I grew up right here in the suburbs. I knew my parents, I knew my childhood, and I was only 35 years old. Silas nodded slowly, his shaking hands coming to a rest on the table. He told me he knew I wasn't his boy. He said he had spent 3 decades tracking down false leads, hiring private investigators, and learning to separate desperate, blinding hope from cold reality. But he could not look away from me. Over his untouched cherry pie and my 3rd cup of black coffee, he told me about his son, Simon. Simon was a bright, mechanically gifted kid who drove off to college one crisp autumn morning in 1996 and simply vanished off the face of the earth. His car was found abandoned at a rest stop on the interstate. The doors were unlocked. His wallet was on the passenger seat. No signs of a struggle. No ransom notes. Just a ghost story that destroyed a father's life, dividing his timeline permanently into a before and an after. As Silas spoke about his agonizing pain, my own pain flared up, a dull, throbbing ache in my chest that threatened to swallow me whole. Listening to him talk about the family he lost, I could not help but think about the last 12 years of my own life and the family that had just casually thrown me away. Valerie and I met in our early 20s. I was grinding through long shifts at the warehouse, wearing steel-toed boots, trying to prove my worth to the world. She came from money, old quiet, arrogant money. Richard and Martha had built a comfortable fortune in commercial real estate, and from the day I met them, I was never good enough. I remember our second Thanksgiving dinner at their sprawling suburban estate, a memory that still burns the back of my throat. The dining room looked like a magazine cover. Richard sat at the head of the table, carving a massive turkey. Out of nowhere, in front of aunts, uncles, and cousins, Richard asked me about my 401k and my investment portfolio. When I told him I was focusing on climbing the ladder in logistics and building a solid savings account, he laughed. A sharp, mocking laugh that silenced the entire room. He looked at Valerie, shook his head and said, "Well, at least he has a strong back. He's going to need it lifting boxes for the rest of his life." Valerie didn't defend me. She just looked down at her plate, embarrassed by my existence. For 12 years, I swallowed my pride. I took the extra shifts. I managed a team of 50 people. I bought a nice house in a good neighborhood, stretching my budget to the absolute limit just to give Valerie the lifestyle she felt entitled to. I set up a college fund for Preston and Clara the week they were born, putting away every spare dollar I earned. I thought doing the right thing, being a faithful husband, a present father, and a hard worker would eventually earn their respect. But it never did. Valerie's spending habits always outpaced my promotions. She constantly compared our modest beach vacations to her friends' lavish trips to Europe. She compared my practical, reliable Honda to the luxury SUVs sitting in her parents' driveway. Slowly, the affection faded. The warmth evaporated. She stopped asking about my day. She started spending more time going to networking events and expensive wine tastings, leaving me to put the kids to bed alone. I convinced myself it was just a rough patch. I convinced myself that if I just worked a little harder, made a little more money, bought her that designer bag she wanted, she would look at me the way she used to. I was a fool, a blind, desperate fool. Sitting in the diner, holding the picture of a dead man who shared my face, I realized Silas and I were both ghosts. He was haunted by the past, desperately searching for a boy who was likely gone forever. And I had just been erased from the present, discarded by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Silas ordered another round of coffee from Beatrice. He looked at me with total, piercing clarity. He told me he had spent millions over the last 30 years hiring private investigators, running national campaigns, and consulting forensic artists. None of them could accurately predict what his son would look like today. The computer-generated age progressions always looked fake, lifeless. Then he pointed a weathered finger at my face. He said I was the living, breathing answer he had been looking for. He wanted to hire me. He wanted me to be the public face of his ongoing missing persons foundation. He needed someone to stand in rooms, talk to law enforcement agencies, and let forensic artists use my face as a baseline. I laughed a bitter, hollow laugh. I told him I had just lost my job, my wife, and my kids in the span of a few hours. I told him I was a total mess, a liability, a man who didn't even know where he was going to sleep tomorrow night. Silas didn't blink. He leaned in closer. He told me he would double whatever salary I was making at the logistics firm. He told me he had a large farm property a few hours outside the city with a vacant, fully furnished guest cottage. I could live there rent-free. He said he wasn't offering me this out of pity. He was offering it because my face was the most valuable asset he had found in 3 decades. It was a business transaction, but it was the best offer I was going to get on the worst day of my life. I looked at this grieving old man. He did not care about my bank account, my job title, or Richard's commercial real estate empire. He just saw value in me. For the first time all day, for the first time in years, I felt like a human being again. I reached across the sticky diner table and shook his hand. 2 days later, I packed the rest of my personal belongings. I left the expensive furniture, the massive television, the high-end kitchen appliances Valerie insisted on buying to impress her friends. She could have it all. My lawyer, a public defender type I could barely afford, advised me not to fight over the physical house right now, to focus my limited resources on the impending custody battle. I drove out to Silas's farm, leaving my old life in the rearview mirror. The property was breathtaking. Hundreds of acres of rolling hills, dense woods, and a massive, beautifully maintained main house that looked like it belonged in a historical registry. The guest cottage sat a quarter-mile behind the main house. It was secluded, quiet, with a wood-burning stove and a porch overlooking a vast cornfield. It was exactly what I needed to clear my head and figure out how to fight for my kids. I spent the first few days settling in, organizing the few boxes I brought with me. I set up a small desk by the window. One evening, as the sun was setting over the fields, I was digging through a box of old electronics I had swept out of the home office desk back in the suburbs. At the bottom of the box, buried under a tangle of charging cables, was an old iPad. It was one Valerie used to use a few years ago before she upgraded to the newest, most expensive model. She must have forgotten it was in that drawer when she packed her things. I plugged it into the wall outlet, thinking I might wipe the memory clean and give it to Preston so he could play games when he came to visit me. The Apple logo appeared. The screen lit up. It automatically connected to the cottage's Wi-Fi network, since it remembered my old iCloud keychain settings. Suddenly, the screen flooded with notifications. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. The iPad was still synced to Valerie's current cloud account, pulling down every single iMessage she had sent or received over the last 2 years. I wasn't trying to snoop. I swear to you I was just trying to factory reset the device. But the preview text on the lock screen caught my eye. The messages were from an unsaved number, just a string of digits. The text read, "Is it done? Did he sign the severance papers?" My blood ran cold. The air in the room felt suddenly very thin. I stared at the screen. I knew the passcode. She had never changed it from our anniversary date. My fingers trembled as I typed in the 4 digits. I opened the messaging app. I stared at the screen. I scrolled up. Days, weeks, months of messages. The profile picture attached to the unsaved number finally loaded. It was Julian, my new boss, the man who had fired me. I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest cottage, the harsh, blue glow of the iPad illuminating the dark room. I read every single message, every word, every timestamp. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs I thought it was going to break through my chest. Julian and Valerie had been having an affair for over 14 months. They met at one of her so-called networking events, a charity gala for local real estate developers that I stayed home from because Clara had a fever. Julian was ambitious, cutthroat, and exactly the kind of wealthy status symbol Richard and Martha always wanted for their daughter. He drove a Porsche. He wore bespoke suits. He was everything I was not. But the affair was only the beginning of the nightmare. The messages outlined a deliberate, calculated, deeply sinister plot to destroy me financially and emotionally. The corporate merger that led to my firing wasn't just bad luck. Julian's company had acquired my logistics firm 6 months ago. The messages proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that Julian actively lobbied his superiors to handle the restructuring in my region specifically so he could terminate my employment. He manufactured the efficiency excuse. They timed it perfectly. Valerie wanted to file for divorce while I was unemployed so the family court judge would look at my zero income, calculate massive alimony based on my previous 12 years of earnings, and force me to liquidate my meager savings and the kids' college funds just to pay her off. Julian even bragged in a text about how he gave me the absolute minimum severance package legally allowed, intentionally withholding the standard executive buyout I should have been entitled to. He looked like a beaten dog in the conference room. Julian had texted her the afternoon he fired me. Valerie replied with a laughing emoji. Good. Let him whine. The lawyer says without a steady income or a permanent address, he has zero chance at 50-50 custody. I want full control of the kids. I don't want his mediocrity rubbing off on them. I gripped the edges of the iPad until my fingers cramped and the metal dug into my palms. My own wife, the mother of my children. She didn't just fall out of love with me. She conspired to ruin my life, to take my children away, and to humiliate me on her way out. And the worst part? Her parents knew. A text from Valerie explicitly mentioned that Richard was thrilled Julian was finally clearing the path and getting rid of the dead weight. The rage that washed over me was blinding. It wasn't just anger. It was a primal, violent fury. I wanted to drive over to Richard's gated community, kick the mahogany front door off its hinges, and tear Julian apart with my bare hands. I picked up my phone and dialed Valerie's number. She answered on the third ring. The background noise sounded like a fancy, expensive restaurant. Clinking wine glasses, soft jazz. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. My voice was dangerously calm. A dead, flat tone that even scared me. I told her I found the iPad. I told her I knew about Julian. I told her I knew the firing was a setup. A corporate conspiracy orchestrated by her lover. The background noise stopped. Valerie stepped away from the table. I could hear a door close, probably the restroom. Her voice dropped to a vicious, venomous whisper. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she threatened me. She told me her family had retained the most ruthless, expensive divorce lawyer in the state. She said if I dared to make a fuss, if I tried to drag Julian's name through the mud or take this to court, she would claim I was mentally unstable. She would use my unemployment and my current living situation, a guest cottage on a farm, against me, and make sure I only got supervised visits with Preston and Clara once a month in a sterile government facility. You have nothing, Harrison? She spat through the phone, her voice dripping with contempt. You're living in some old man's shed in the middle of nowhere. You can't afford a real lawyer. You can't afford to fight us. Don't play games with me. You will lose, and you will never see your kids again. She hung up. I threw my phone against the wall. It shattered into 3 pieces. I sat in the dark, breathing heavily, the reality of my situation settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She was right. She had the money. She had the aggressive lawyer. She had her parents' limitless resources. I was fighting a war with a plastic spoon. The next morning, I walked up to the main house to start my work for Silas. The anger was still boiling under my skin, a toxic sludge in my veins, but I forced myself to focus. Silas had built an extensive network for his missing persons foundation. My job was to review case files, cross-reference state and federal databases, and manage a team of private investigators Silas had on retainer across the country. One of those investigators was a guy named Felix. Felix was a slick, fast-talking private eye from Chicago who had been billing Silas an outrageous hourly rate for 3 years. That afternoon, Felix walked into the home office with a smug look on his face, smelling heavily of cheap cologne and cigarettes. He dropped a thick, sealed folder on Silas's mahogany desk. He claimed he had found a major lead, a DNA match in a neighboring state. Felix said an unidentified man in a psychiatric ward shared partial genetic markers with Silas's profile. Silas stood up, his hands shaking violently, tears instantly welling in his tired eyes. For a moment, the old man looked so fragile, so desperately eager for the 30-year nightmare to end. Felix immediately started talking logistics, claiming he needed an immediate wire transfer advance of $50,000 to secure the hospital records, bribe a few administrators, and expedite the legal transfer of the patient. Something felt profoundly wrong. I spent 12 years in logistics, tracking massive shipping containers, verifying complex manifests, and catching supply chain fraud. I knew when paperwork didn't add up. I knew the smell of a hustle. I asked Felix to see the lab report. He hesitated, getting defensive, crossing his arms and claiming it was highly confidential and protected by HIPAA laws. I didn't wait for his permission. I snatched the folder from the desk and ripped it open. I looked at the letterhead of the lab. I looked at the font. I looked at the timestamp on the bottom of the printed page. I walked over to my computer, pulled up a browser, and ran a basic public records search on the corporate registry for the laboratory Felix claimed processed the DNA. The lab had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and permanently closed its doors 14 months ago. The timestamp on Felix's official report was from last Tuesday. I turned around and looked Felix dead in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I just laid out the cold, hard facts. I explained how the font on the lab results didn't match the standard output for a federal CODIS database query. I pointed out the defunct status of the lab. I showed Silas the screen. Felix stammered. His face turned bright red, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to backtrack, stuttering that his assistant must have pulled the wrong file, that it was a clerical error. I stepped toward him, invading his personal space. I told him to get the hell out of the house before I called the state police for criminal fraud, wire fraud, and extortion of a vulnerable adult. Felix grabbed his coat, muttered a curse word, and ran out the door without looking back. Silas sat slowly back down in his heavy leather chair. The desperate hope drained from his face, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. He looked at the fake paperwork on his desk, realizing how close he had come to being exploited again by a predator feeding on his grief. But then his expression shifted. He looked up at me. He looked at me not just as a face that resembled his lost son, but as a protector, as someone who gave a damn. He asked me how I spotted the fake so quickly. I told him I spent a decade identifying discrepancies for a massive corporation, managing millions of dollars in inventory. I told him nobody gets to lie on my watch. Silas walked over to a crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch. He handed me one. He looked at my face, really looked at me. He saw the dark circles under my eyes. He saw the suppressed rage vibrating in my jaw. He asked me what was really going on with me. I drank the scotch in one swallow. It burned all the way down. And then I told him everything. I poured out the entire pathetic story. I told him about Valerie, about Julian, about finding the iPad, and the custody threats. I told him I was terrified I was going to lose Preston and Clara because I didn't have the financial firepower to fight a wealthy, connected family in family court. I told him I felt like a complete failure as a father. Silas listened in complete silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't pat my shoulder and tell me it was going to be okay. When I finally finished, out of breath and shaking with residual anger, he put his glass down on the desk. "They think you have nothing," Silas said quietly, staring out the window at the fields. "I do have nothing," I replied, my voice breaking. Silas stood up. He walked over to a heavy steel safe built into the wall in the corner of the room. He spun the combination dial, opened the heavy door, and pulled out a stack of thick, leather-bound legal binders. He walked back and dropped them on the desk in front of me with a heavy thud. "Harrison," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, commanding register, "go back to the cottage and put on a suit. We are going into the city." The drive into the city was entirely quiet. The silence in the car was thick, heavy with anticipation. I wore the only dark suit I hadn't left behind at the house, a charcoal 2-piece that suddenly felt like armor. Silas drove a sleek, understated black town car. I didn't know exactly where we were going, but the grim, unyielding determination on the old man's face told me not to ask questions. I just watched the cornfields turn into suburbs, and the suburbs turn into towering steel and glass. Meanwhile, my new phone, A cheap replacement burner I bought at a gas station that morning was vibrating constantly in my pocket. It was blowing up with emails from Valerie's attorney. They were insanely aggressive. They were demanding I sign an emergency temporary custody order giving Valerie sole physical and legal custody, citing my unstable living conditions and lack of employment. The emails explicitly stated that if I fought this in court, they would drag out the proceedings, seek to limit my visitation to supervised weekends, and force me to pay all their exorbitant legal fees. They were trying to bully me into submission before I could even establish a defense, using fear and intimidation to break my spirit. We pulled into the heart of the financial district. Silas drove into the underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper, swiping a VIP access card that opened a private gate. We walked to a dedicated executive elevator and took it all the way to the top floor. The doors opened into a massive, minimalist reception area, all marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city. Behind the reception desk, massive steel letters on the wall read, "The Orley Trust." I followed Silas past a dozen busy financial analysts, junior partners, and lawyers in expensive suits. Every single one of them stopped what they were doing to nod respectfully at him, stepping out of his way with profound deference. We walked down a long hallway and entered a corner office with a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Sitting at a massive mahogany conference table were three high-powered corporate attorneys. They stood up immediately, buttoning their jackets when Silas entered the room. Silas motioned for me to sit down in a high-backed leather chair. He remained standing. He looked at the lead attorney, a sharp, formidable woman in her 50s named Eleanor, whose eyes were as cold and calculating as a sniper's. "Eleanor," Silas said, pointing a finger at me, "this is Harrison. He is the new chief executive officer of the Orley Trust." I almost fell out of my chair. My jaw hit the floor. I looked at Silas, completely dumbfounded, my brain failing to process the words. I stammered, telling him I was hired to manage his missing persons foundation, not a financial empire. I didn't have an Ivy League MBA. I was a logistics manager. Silas sat down next to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. He explained calmly that the Missing Persons Foundation was just a passion project, a way to channel his grief. The Orley Trust was his actual life's work. He owned massive, controlling stakes in commercial real estate developments, international shipping logistics networks, and emerging technology firms. He was a silent billionaire, operating in the shadows, letting his board handle the public-facing aspects of the business. And because of the tragedy with his son, he had no heirs. No one to leave his empire to. "I have spent 30 years letting people take advantage of my grief," Silas said, his voice echoing in the large room. "Felix was just the latest parasite. But you, Harrison, you protected me. You didn't just see a paycheck, you saw a human being. You have integrity. You have the exact logistical and operational background this trust requires to manage our shipping assets. And more importantly, you are a good father who needs a sword to fight the monsters at your door." Eleanor slid a massive stack of thick contracts toward me across the polished wood table. She explained the compensation package in a crisp, professional tone. A 7-figure base salary, extensive stock options, full access to the trust's elite corporate legal division. "Your ex-wife's family plays in the shallow end of the pool, Harrison," Eleanor said, tapping her expensive fountain pen on the table. "They think they have money because they own a few strip malls. They think they have power because they can afford a loud divorce attorney. We are about to show them what real institutional power looks like." I picked up the pen. My hand was remarkably steady. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name on the dotted line on every single page. In a matter of seconds, my net worth eclipsed Richard and Martha's combined assets tenfold. I was no longer an unemployed, discarded warehouse manager. I was the head of a billion-dollar trust, armed with the best legal minds money could buy. We spent the next 4 hours preparing for war. Eleanor took my cheap burner phone and synced it to their secure servers, downloading all the evidence from Valerie's old iPad. The text messages between Valerie and Julian, the explicit, Undeniable proof of Julian orchestrating my termination for personal gain. Eleanor smiled a terrifying, predatory smile as she read the transcripts. Julian's company is publicly traded, she noted, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee. Using corporate restructuring to eliminate a romantic rival and manipulate a divorce settlement is a massive breach of fiduciary duty, corporate ethics, and potentially constitutes tortious interference and fraud. We aren't just going to win custody, Harrison. We are going to bury them so deep they won't see daylight. Over the next 2 weeks, I played my part perfectly. It was the hardest acting job of my life, but I executed it flawlessly. I did not respond to Valerie's aggressive emails. I let her lawyer send threatening letters to my old address. I let Valerie, Julian, Richard, and Martha believe they had completely broken me. I wanted them arrogant. I wanted them sloppy. I wanted them walking into that courtroom thinking they had already won. The date of the preliminary custody hearing finally arrived. It was a cold, overcast Thursday morning. I woke up at the guest cottage on Silas's farm. I took a hot shower. I stood in front of the mirror and tied a heavy silk tie. I looked at the man staring back at me. He wasn't the tired, defeated husband who begged his wife to stay on the porch. He was a father going to war for his children, armed with nuclear codes and a billionaire's legal team. Silas met me outside by the car, leaning on his cane. He reached out and adjusted the lapel of my suit, nodding approvingly. "Do not let them see you sweat," Silas told me, his eyes fierce. "You let Eleanor and the documents do the talking. You let them hang themselves with their own arrogance." I nodded. I got in the back of the town car. Eleanor was already waiting inside, organizing a briefcase full of beautifully bound, legally devastating destruction. We pulled out of the driveway and drove toward the downtown courthouse. The storm was finally here, and I was sitting right in the dead center of the eye, ready to unleash hell. The heavy oak doors of the downtown family court building loomed ahead of us like the gates of an ancient, unforgiving fortress. It was a bleak, overcast Thursday morning in late October. The kind of day where the bitter wind seems to bypass your coat and seep right through the soles of your shoes, chilling the bone. I walked through the metal detectors at the main entrance, emptying my pockets, placing my watch, my keys, and my belt into the scratched plastic bin. I watched my own hands as I retrieved my items. They were completely steady. There was no tremor, no clammy sweat, no nervous fidgeting. 2 weeks ago, I would have been an absolute wreck, sweating through the collar of a cheap, ill-fitting shirt, terrified of the legal slaughter that I believed awaited me. I would have been agonizing over every possible worst-case scenario, picturing my children being ripped away from me by a system that favored the wealthy and the ruthless. But today was different. Today, I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, crafted from Italian wool, paid for entirely by the Orley Trust's executive expense account. Beside me walked Margaret, the lead corporate litigator for the trust, a woman whose mere presence commanded the airspace around her. I felt nothing but a cold, hard, crystalline focus. The kind of focus a soldier feels when the waiting is finally over and the battle has begun. We took the crowded elevator up to the 4th floor. The hallway outside courtroom 4B smelled intensely of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and the undeniable scent of human anxiety. It was crowded with fractured families, couples refusing to look at each other, aggressive lawyers whispering fiercely to their clients, and the general, heavy misery of broken promises. And then, down at the far end of the corridor, near the frosted glass windows of the courtroom doors, I saw them. My ex-wife, Valerie, was sitting on a scarred wooden bench. She had dressed for the occasion with the calculated precision of a Hollywood actress aiming for an Oscar. She was wearing a conservative, pale blue designer dress that managed to look simultaneously expensive and demure. Her hair, usually blown out in voluminous waves, was pulled back into a neat, sensible, unpretentious clip. She was playing the part of the exhausted, deeply concerned, responsible mother to absolute perfection. She held a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at eyes that held no actual tears. Sitting right next to her, holding her hand with a sickening display of possessive affection, was Julian. He had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to show up to my custody hearing. He was wearing his signature perfectly tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He looked every bit the wealthy, supportive, stabilizing new partner stepping in to rescue a family from the clutches of a deadbeat dad. He was whispering into Valerie's ear, making her nod bravely. Flanking them on either side, standing like royal guards, were Richard and Martha, my former in-laws. Richard was leaning casually against the marble wall, checking his expensive gold watch, looking deeply inconvenienced, as if he was waiting for a delayed tea time at his exclusive country club rather than a legal hearing to rip a devoted father away from his children. Martha was holding a boutique, artisanal coffee cup, leaning down to whisper something into Valerie's ear and patting her shoulder with an exaggerated show of maternal sympathy. They saw me approach down the long hallway. I watched the collective, arrogant smirk ripple across their faces like a wave. Richard actually scoffed, a short, sharp, dismissive puff of air that echoed slightly in the corridor. He shook his head, muttering something to Julian. Valerie looked me up and down, taking in the new charcoal suit, the polished shoes, the confident stride. For a fraction of a second, confusion flashed in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a condescending, mocking smile. She probably assumed I had rented the suit, or put it on a high-interest credit card I couldn't possibly afford, just to look presentable and beg for the judge's mercy. Julian just stared at me with that same dead-eyed, corporate superiority he had worn the day he slid my termination papers across the mahogany conference room table. None of them spoke a single word to me. They didn't feel they needed to. Their body language screamed that the war was already over and they were just here to collect the spoils. They believed they held absolutely all the cards. They believed I was just a desperate, unemployed, broken warehouse manager living in an old man's shed in the middle of nowhere, showing up to take my inevitable, humiliating beating. Margaret didn't even glance in their direction. She didn't acknowledge their existence. She simply adjusted the handle of her heavy leather briefcase, checked a notification on her phone, and said, her voice a low, smooth hum, "Let's go to work, Harrison." The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a tired expression, opened the heavy wooden doors and called our case number into the hallway. We walked into the courtroom. It was a sterile, deeply intimidating space with high, vaulted ceilings, heavy oak wood paneling, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low, constant hum. The judge, a stern-looking man in his late 60s with deep grooves around his mouth and a no-nonsense demeanor, took his seat at the elevated bench. Valerie's lawyer, a slick, famously aggressive attorney named Gregory, stood up immediately. Gregory had a notorious reputation in the city for being an absolute bulldog in family court. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you didn't just want a divorce. You wanted to absolutely obliterate your ex-spouse, salt the earth they stood on, and leave them with absolutely nothing. He wore a pinstripe suit and a predatory grin. Gregory began his opening statement to the judge, and it was a masterpiece of legal character assassination. He paced back and forth, painting a picture of me that made the acid churn in my stomach. He utilized every trick in the book. He told the judge, with a voice dripping with manufactured sorrow, that I was chronically unmotivated, that I had systematically failed to provide adequate financial stability for my family, which directly led to the tragic breakdown of the marriage. He smoothly, seamlessly transitioned into the events of the past month. He framed my termination from Meridian Logistics not as a standard corporate layoff, but as a direct, inevitable result of my incompetence, my laziness, and my stubborn inability to adapt to modern, rigorous business practices. "Your Honor," Gregory bellowed, his voice echoing powerfully in the quiet, tense room. "My client, Valerie, is not acting out of malice. She is a desperate mother simply trying to protect her two young children from a devastating cycle of instability and failure. The respondent, Harrison, is currently completely unemployed. He has 0 streams of income. He has been rightfully forced to vacate the family home due to his inability to contribute, and he is currently residing in a rural, uninsulated, temporary guest cottage on a farming property owned by a complete stranger. A stranger, I might add, who has no legal obligation to house him past tomorrow. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded perfectly still in front of me on the polished wood. I didn't shake my head. I didn't let my jaw clench. I didn't jump up and object to the blatant lies. I just sat there, breathing slowly, and let him talk. I let him build the exact, precarious narrative we desperately wanted him to build. Gregory went on to praise Julian, literally pointing to him where he sat in the gallery, chest puffed out. Gregory described Julian as a stabilizing, positive force, a highly successful, community-minded corporate executive who was willing and eager to step up and provide the financial, educational, and emotional support that I had so utterly failed to deliver. Richard and Martha nodded vigorously from the wooden benches, looking incredibly pleased with themselves, practically glowing with aristocratic pride. Therefore, Your Honor, Gregory concluded, puffing out his chest, placing both hands firmly on his table and leaning toward the judge. Given the respondent's total lack of resources, his unstable living environment, and his proven history of professional failure, we are requesting that this court grant full legal and physical custody to the mother immediately. We ask that the father be granted strictly supervised visitation at a state-approved facility only after he can prove to this court that he has secured stable employment and a suitable, safe residence. It is the only logical, responsible choice for the physical and psychological welfare of the minor children. Gregory sat down heavily, shooting a smug, victorious look across the aisle at Margaret. He clearly assumed she was just some low-rent, overworked public defender or a cheap strip mall lawyer I had managed to scrape together with my last few dollars. Valerie looked at me across the aisle, her eyes filled with cold, absolute triumph. She thought she had successfully buried me alive. She thought the game was over. The judge slowly looked over his reading glasses at our table, his expression unreadable, though leaning slightly toward skepticism given Gregory's dramatic performance. Does the respondent have anything to present before I make my ruling on this temporary custody order? Margaret stood up. She did not rush. She did not scramble for her notes. She moved with deliberate, terrifying grace. She opened her leather briefcase with a sharp, satisfying click that echoed in the silent room. She didn't project the frantic, desperate energy of a defense attorney trying to bail water out of a sinking ship. She projected the calm, inevitable, terrifying energy of a seasoned executioner who had just arrived at the gallows, carrying a very sharp axe. "Yes, Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice smooth, deeply authoritative, and completely devoid of any frantic emotion. "We have quite a bit of substantive evidence to present today. In fact, we believe the petitioner and her counsel have fundamentally, and perhaps criminally, misled this court regarding almost every single material fact in this case." Margaret walked confidently from behind our table to the center of the courtroom, holding a thick, meticulously organized stack of professionally bound legal documents. She handed one heavy copy to the bailiff to pass up to the judge's bench, and walked another copy directly over to Gregory's table, dropping it in front of him with a heavy, resounding thud. "Let us begin with the opposing counsel's foundational claim that my client is unemployed, destitute, and unable to provide financial stability for his children," Margaret stated, turning her body slightly to look directly at Valerie, who was suddenly gripping the edge of her table. "Your Honor, I direct your attention to the first tab, page 3 of the binder." The judge wet his thumb and flipped the heavy parchment page. Gregory frantically flipped the page of his copy. I sat perfectly still and watched Gregory's eyes scan the top paragraph of the document. The transformation was instantaneous and beautiful. Within 3 seconds, the arrogant smugness completely vanished from his face, replaced first by profound confusion, then by a rapidly spreading, sheer panic. The color literally drained from his cheeks. "That document, Your Honor, is a finalized, notarized, and legally binding executive employment contract," Margaret explained to the court, her voice ringing clear as a bell. "As of 2 weeks ago, my client Harrison was officially appointed as the chief executive officer of the Orley Trust. For the court's reference, The Orley Trust is a private, multi-billion-dollar financial, logistics, and real estate holding company based in this city. Harrison's starting base salary is $1.5 million annually. This is exclusive of his stock options, his annual performance bonuses, and a comprehensive, top-tier executive benefits package that fully covers premium healthcare, dental, and vision for both of his minor children. The courtroom went absolutely, deathly silent. You could have heard a dust mite land on the floor. Valerie's jaw actually fell open. She lost all control of her carefully crafted facial expressions. She leaned over violently to look at the document on Gregory's table, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated horror as she read the numbers printed in black ink. Richard, sitting proudly in the gallery just moments before, sat up so fast he audibly gasped and almost dropped his phone onto the floor. Furthermore, Margaret continued, not giving them a single microscopic second to recover their breath. Regarding my client's living situation, which counsel found so deeply concerning, the rural, uninsulated farm opposing counsel so disparagingly referred to is, in fact, a 300-acre private, high-security estate owned outright by the trust. My client was merely residing in the newly renovated, fully modernized guest house temporarily, while his new, $5 million primary residence, located in the city's most exclusive, heavily guarded gated community, was finishing its specialized security and landscaping upgrades. He holds the deed to that property free and clear, without a mortgage. It is included under tab 2, page 7. The judge looked closely at the deed, traced the seal with his finger, then looked down at me. The skepticism in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a glimmer of profound respect and intense curiosity. Counsel, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave as he glared at Gregory. Did you, or did you not, verify the respondent's employment status and financial disclosures before making your highly defamatory opening statement to this court? Gregory stammered, physically pulling at his shirt collar as if the room had suddenly run out of oxygen. Your Honor, we were operating under the good faith impression, based on his termination just weeks ago, that his financial situation was. Which brings me directly to my next and most crucial point, Your Honor. Margaret interrupted smoothly, her voice suddenly sharpening into a lethal blade. She walked back to her briefcase and pulled out a second, much thicker, red-bound binder. The specific, highly suspicious circumstances surrounding my client's termination from his previous employer, Meridian Logistics. She handed the new binders out, ensuring the judge had his copy first. We are formally entering into the public record a certified, digitally authenticated transcript of text messages. These messages were legally extracted from an iPad previously owned by the petitioner, Valerie, which she abandoned at the marital residence. These are direct, unfiltered communications between the petitioner and a man named Julian. The same Julian who is currently sitting in the gallery of this courtroom, presenting himself as a moral savior. Julian froze completely. All the blood left his face, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. He stopped breathing. Your Honor, these messages do not just show an extramarital affair, Margaret announced, pacing slowly, methodically in front of the judge's bench. They detail a coordinated, premeditated, malicious corporate conspiracy. Julian, acting in his official capacity as Vice President of Operations at Meridian, abused his corporate authority to specifically target, isolate, and terminate my client during a corporate merger. He deliberately manufactured a false, completely fabricated narrative of operational efficiency, specifically to eliminate Harrison from the payroll. Objection! Gregory shouted, jumping to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He clearly had no idea what was happening, but his survival instinct demanded he try to stop the bleeding. Relevance, Your Honor. This is a family court custody hearing, not a corporate tribunal or a civil suit for wrongful termination. It is highly, undeniably relevant to the character and fitness of the mother, Your Honor. Margaret fired back, stepping toward Gregory without flinching. Because the messages explicitly, in the petitioner's own words, prove that the termination was orchestrated specifically to manipulate this exact divorce proceeding. Julian and Valerie colluded, planning the timeline for months, to ensure my client would be completely unemployed at the exact moment she filed for divorce. The stated goal, written in black and white, was to artificially deflate Harrison's income for child support and alimony calculations, and to sabotage his financial ability to retain counsel and fight for custody of his children. It is a textbook, undeniable case of fraud upon the court and malicious psychological abuse of a parent. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. Overruled. Counsel, direct my attention to the specific text messages. I want to read them right now. Margaret read them out loud. She didn't rush. She enunciated every single syllable. She read Julian bragging, laughing about intentionally giving me the absolute legal minimum severance package to ensure I couldn't afford a lawyer. She read Valerie replying with laughing emojis, stating that I looked like a beaten dog when I came home. She read Valerie explicitly stating she wanted full, total control of the kids because she didn't want my pathetic mediocrity rubbing off on them. She even read the chilling texts mentioning Richard, the grandfather, giving his enthusiastic approval of the plan to financially ruin the father of his grandchildren. With every single word Margaret spoke, the invisible, arrogant empire Valerie and her family had built around themselves crumbled into fine dust and blew away. Julian, unable to handle the pressure, suddenly stood up in the gallery, his face red with panic. "This is illegal. Those are private messages. You hacked her device. This is inadmissible," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Margaret. The judge pointed a stern, furious finger directly at Julian. "Sir, you will sit down and you will remain absolutely silent, or I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs, remove you from my courtroom, and hold you in criminal contempt. Do you understand me?" Julian sank back into the hard wooden bench, pulling his head down between his shoulders, looking exactly like the trapped, desperate rat he was. Margaret turned slowly to face the gallery, looking directly into Julian's terrified eyes. "I should also inform this court and Mr. Julian that exactly 30 minutes before this custody hearing began, my legal office formally submitted this entire binder of evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as directly to the Board of Directors of Meridian Logistics. Using a corporate restructuring event to fraudulently eliminate a romantic rival and manipulate a legal proceeding is a massive breach of fiduciary duty, corporate ethics, and likely constitutes federal wire fraud. I imagine you will be hearing from federal investigators and your former employers very shortly." Julian put his head entirely between his hands, burying his face. He was finished. His high-flying career, his pristine reputation, his stock options, his entire life was completely over in a matter of seconds. Margaret turned back to the judge, her voice dropping to a tone of absolute, unwavering resolve. "Your Honor, my client, Harrison, is a devoted, loving father with the vast financial, housing, and educational resources of a multi-billion-dollar trust at his immediate disposal. The petitioner, Valerie, on the other hand, has demonstrated a shocking, documented willingness to engage in systemic fraud, profound emotional manipulation, and illegal collusion specifically designed to harm the father of her children. We respectfully ask that this court grant immediate, primary physical and legal custody to Harrison, with Valerie receiving only standard, strictly supervised visitation until she undergoes a comprehensive psychological evaluation." The judge slowly closed the heavy red binder. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room returned. He looked over at Valerie's table. She was violently shaking, tears streaming down her face, her perfect, untouchable facade completely, irreparably shattered. Her lawyer, Gregory, was staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact with the judge. He then looked at me. I sat tall, my spine perfectly straight, my hands still folded calmly, meeting his gaze with the unwavering, quiet confidence of a man who had walked barefoot through hell and come out holding the keys to the kingdom. "Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey." The judge did not hesitate. He didn't call for a recess. He didn't ask to retreat to his chambers to deliberate or review precedents. The evidence presented by Margaret was so overwhelmingly thorough, so undeniable, and so utterly damning that the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Based on the irrefutable documentary evidence presented in this courtroom today, the judge began, his voice laced with a heavy, palpable disgust as he glared down at Valerie's table. "This court finds the actions of the petitioner to be deeply manipulative, profoundly deceitful, and entirely contrary to the best interests of the minor children involved. The calculated attempt to weaponize a corporate layoff to manufacture an artificial financial crisis, simply to gain an unfair advantage in a custody dispute, is quite frankly one of the most egregious, offensive abuses of the legal system I have witnessed in my 30 years on the bench." He picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "Primary physical and sole legal custody of the minor children, Preston and Clara, is awarded immediately to the respondent, Harrison. The petitioner, Valerie, will be allowed supervised visitation only, restricted to every other weekend, at a state-approved facility at her own expense. Furthermore, the court is ordering an immediate, full forensic audit of the petitioner's finances. I am also formally referring the evidence of collusion and potential fraud presented here today directly to the District Attorney's Office for a thorough criminal investigation. This hearing is adjourned." He slammed the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed through the room like thunder. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. It was a total, unconditional, absolute victory. I stood up slowly, buttoned the center button of my charcoal suit jacket, and turned to Margaret. I extended my hand. She took it, giving me a firm shake and a small, incredibly rare smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Like I told you in the office, Harrison," she murmured quietly, packing her documents back into her briefcase. "We don't play in the shallow end of the pool. Let's go collect your children." As we walked away from the defense table and pushed through the swinging wooden doors out of the courtroom, the reality of their complete destruction was unfolding in real time in the hallway. We stepped onto the marble floor, and absolute chaos immediately erupted around us. Valerie practically burst through the doors behind us. She broke away from her lawyer, Gregory, who was currently busy ignoring her and packing his own bags, realizing he wasn't going to get paid his full retainer for this disaster. She ran down the hallway toward me. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her carefully styled hair coming completely undone, wild strands sticking to her wet cheeks. "Harrison! Harrison! Please wait! Stop!" she cried out, her voice echoing shrilly off the marble walls, drawing the stares of everyone else waiting for their hearings. She lunged forward and reached out, grabbing the sleeve of my jacket with desperate, clawing fingers. I stopped. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show a single ounce of the burning anger that had consumed me for the last month. I just looked down at her manicured hand clutching my expensive wool sleeve with absolute, freezing, terrifying indifference. I slowly, deliberately, pulled my arm away, stepping back so she couldn't touch me again. "Do not touch me, Valerie," I said. My voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried the absolute, unyielding weight of a judge's final sentence. "Please," she sobbed, completely breaking down, falling to her knees in the middle of the crowded hallway, abandoning all her aristocratic pride. "You can't do this. You can't take Preston and Clara away from me. I'm their mother. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Julian manipulated me. He got in my head. He told me it was the only way we could be happy. I'm sorry, Harrison. I'm so sorry. We can fix this. Cancel the divorce. We can go to counseling. I will do whatever you want. Please, I know you still love me. You're a good man, you wouldn't do this to me." I stared down at her. I looked at the woman I had spent 12 years of my life trying desperately to please. The woman I had worked graveyard shifts for. The woman who had looked me in the eye just weeks ago and called me a worthless failure. "You aren't sorry for what you did, Valerie?" I said quietly, my voice devoid of any pity. ensuring only she could hear the finality in my tone. You are only sorry that you lost. You thought I was weak. You thought my value as a human being was entirely tied to a modest paycheck at a logistics warehouse. You thought you could throw me away like garbage. But my value was in my loyalty, my dedication as a father, and my integrity. And you threw all of that in the trash for a man who is about to go to federal prison. You have no one to blame but the woman in the mirror. I looked past her weeping form. Julian was frantically pacing near the elevators at the end of the hall. His cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. He looked like a man having a heart attack. He was shouting at someone on the other end of the line, his face pale and slick with sweat. Judging by the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes and the way his hands were shaking, Margaret's emails to his board of directors and the SEC had already landed like a bomb on his desk. He was likely being terminated with cause in real time, his millions in stock options frozen. His pristine corporate career instantly vaporized into thin air. He didn't even look over at Valerie groveling on the floor. He was entirely, selfishly consumed by the flames of his own destruction. Just then, Richard and Martha marched up to us, their faces red with fury and embarrassment, desperately trying to salvage whatever scrap of dignity and control they felt they had left. Richard stepped over his crying daughter and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "Listen here, Harrison, you little punk," Richard barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming, intimidating authority. Shook with fear. "You think you've won because you stumbled into some ridiculous, lucky trust fund job? You think playing dress-up makes you a CEO? You are still a nobody. You will never be one of us. If you think you can just waltz in here and take our grandchildren away, you are sorely mistaken. I will spend every last dime of my real estate fortune. I will hire a dozen appellate lawyers. I will drag you through appellate courts for the next 10 years until you are bankrupt and begging for mercy." I looked at Richard. I didn't feel intimidated. I didn't feel small. I actually laughed. A genuine, relaxed, deep laugh that echoed in the hallway and made Richard physically flinch backward. "Richard," I said, stepping closer to him, forcing him to look me squarely in the eyes. I leaned in close. "The Orley Trust's legal retainer for a single month is significantly larger than the entire net worth of your pathetic strip mall empire. You don't have enough money to fight me. You don't have enough power to intimidate me anymore. You are a small man playing a very big game. If you ever threaten me again, if you ever try to circumvent the judge's custody order, or if you ever come near my children without my express, written permission, I will have Margaret dismantle your entire commercial real estate business piece by piece, audit every tax return you've filed in the last decade, and I will do it just for the sport of it." Martha gasped loudly, clutching her designer leather purse to her chest as if I were about to mug her. Richard's face turned a deep, mottled purple, but he swallowed hard and took a physical step back. He looked at Margaret, who was standing behind me, offering a chilling, knowing smile. He finally understood the reality of the situation. The hierarchy of power had completely, irreversibly shifted. He was no longer the apex predator of the family. He was prey. I turned my back on all of them. I didn't look over my shoulder. I didn't offer a final word of comfort. I walked down the long, echoing marble corridor with Margaret by my side, leaving Valerie sobbing uncontrollably on the hard floor, begging her parents to somehow fix a massive, self-inflicted problem that could never, ever be fixed. The transition into my new life was immediate, absolute, and profoundly liberating. That very afternoon, armed with the judge's signed emergency custody order, I drove directly to Richard and Martha's sprawling suburban house. I did not go alone. I was accompanied by two massive, highly trained private security contractors provided by the Orley Trust, both wearing dark suits and earpieces. I didn't say a single word to my former in-laws as I walked through their front door. Richard stood in the corner of the living room, fuming silently, but he didn't dare say a word with the security personnel watching his every move. I went straight to the guest rooms and calmly packed up all of my children's belongings. Preston and Clara were confused and a little frightened at first by the sudden change and the presence of the large men in suits. But when I knelt down, hugged them tightly, and told them they were coming to live with me on a massive, beautiful farm with horses, a private lake, and endless green fields to play in. Their tears quickly turned to wide-eyed excitement. We drove out of the suburbs and moved into the newly finished, breathtaking primary residence on Silas's vast estate. It was a sprawling, modern architectural masterpiece, flooded with natural light, but more importantly, it was incredibly safe. It was guarded, secluded, and completely, utterly isolated from the toxic, materialistic influence of Valerie and her family. Establishing ironclad boundaries was the first, most crucial step in our healing process. When Valerie's court-ordered supervised visits finally began a month later, I made sure I was never physically present to see her face. I utilized the trust's resources to hire a licensed, professional family supervisor to handle the handoffs and monitor the weekend visits at the state facility. I blocked Valerie's number on my personal phone. I blocked Richard and Martha. All communication regarding the children's schedules, medical needs, or schooling went through a dedicated, monitored email portal managed entirely by my legal team. If Valerie wanted to ask a question, she had to ask Margaret's paralegals. I cut off the oxygen to her drama completely. I refused to let her narcissism and manipulation infect the peace of my new life. As the months passed, the children thrived in ways I hadn't thought possible. The stress that used to radiate off them in the old house vanished. Preston stopped having the terrible night terrors that had started when Valerie first dragged him away to her parents' house. Clara blossomed, spending her sunny afternoons drawing vivid, colorful pictures on the massive wrap-around porch with Silas. And Silas, he became the grandfather my children truly deserved. He didn't care about what brand of designer clothes they wore, or what prestigious, elite preschool they attended to impress the neighbors. He cared about teaching Preston how to bait a hook and fish in the estate's private pond. He cared about reading adventure stories to Clara in a funny voice until she fell asleep on the couch. He gave them the gift of his time, something Richard had never bothered to do. Professionally, my life transformed in ways I could never have prepared for, but quickly adapted to. I took my role as CEO of the Orley Trust incredibly seriously. I applied the exact same relentless work ethic, the same attention to detail, and the same problem-solving skills I used in logistics to managing Silas's massive financial portfolio. I streamlined their global shipping operations, aggressively negotiated new international freight contracts, and grew the trust's overall value significantly in my first year. But as much as I enjoyed the challenge of the boardroom, the money and the power were not what drove me out of bed in the morning. What truly drove me, what gave my life absolute purpose, was the foundation. Even while running the demanding corporate side of the trust, I dedicated a massive portion of my personal time and the trust's immense resources to Silas's missing persons organization. We cleaned house. We fired the grifters, the con artists, and the useless private eyes like Felix. We hired a team of elite, retired federal investigators and former FBI analysts. We funded and utilized the most advanced facial recognition software and genetic genealogy databases available in the world, sparing absolutely no expense. About a year after the brutal custody battle, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, we received a massive breakthrough. It wasn't Silas's son, Simon, but it was a lead from a dedicated, overworked social worker named Nadine in Portland, Oregon. She contacted our foundation regarding a man with severe, retrograde amnesia who had been living quietly in a state-run assisted living facility for 25 years. He didn't know his name, his age, or where he came from. The staff just called him John. We flew our team out there. We ran his DNA through a specialized, privately funded genetic database we had built, cross-referencing it with older, forgotten, paper-filed missing persons reports from the late 90s that local police departments had given up on. We got a match. A definitive, undeniable match. The man with no memory's real name was Caleb. He had vanished during a solo hiking trip in the treacherous Cascade Mountains in 1998, suffering a massive, traumatic brain injury from a fall that wiped his memory clean before he wandered into a small town miles away. His family, 2 older sisters living in Montana, had never stopped looking for him. They had spent decades wondering if he was dead in a ditch or living a new life. I will never, ever forget the day we flew Caleb's two older sisters out to Oregon on the Trust's private jet. Silas and I stood in the quiet hallway of the state facility, looking through the small glass window of the common room. We watched as those two women, trembling with emotion, walked in and wrapped their arms tightly around the brother they thought was dead and gone for over 2 decades. They wept uncontrollably. They held his weathered face in their hands, kissing his cheeks. Caleb didn't magically remember them. Amnesia doesn't work like the movies, but he smiled, tears forming in his own eyes, feeling the intense, unconditional love radiating from these strangers who knew his soul. I looked over at Silas standing next to me in the hallway. Tears were silently rolling down the old man's deeply weathered cheeks. But it wasn't the bitter, agonizing, desperate grief I had seen in the diner that rainy night a year ago. It was a profound, quiet, beautiful peace. "We brought him home, Harrison," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with heavy emotion, unable to take his eyes off the reunion. "Yes, we did, Silas," I replied, putting my hand firmly on his shoulder. Silas turned slowly and looked at me, his eyes shining brightly. "I spent 30 years looking for my son, Harrison. I spent millions of dollars and countless sleepless nights. I may never find him. He may be gone forever, resting somewhere I can't reach him. But looking at those women in there, if the only thing my pain, my wealth, and my 30 years of searching ever accomplishes is bringing other people's lost children home, then it wasn't for nothing. It was worth every tear." He paused, gripping my hand. "And I didn't find my boy, Harrison, but I found you. You gave me a family again. And that is enough." Standing there in that sterile hallway, watching a broken family piece themselves back together, I finally, completely understood the true meaning of worth. For 12 long years, I let Valerie and her toxic family dictate my value as a man. I let them convince me that because I didn't wear a $10,000 Rolex, because I didn't manipulate corporate ladders or play golf at the country club, because I worked with my hands and cared about loyalty and providing for my family, I was somehow lesser. I let their shallow, ruthless, materialistic metrics define my self-esteem and my identity. But true worth is not determined by the people who casually discard you when you are no longer financially or socially useful to them. True worth is not measured by the balance in a bank account, the brand of your car, or the title printed on a business card. Your worth is determined by your resilience in the darkest moments of your life. It is determined by your capacity to stand up and protect the innocent people who depend on you. It is determined by the strangers who sit across from you in a greasy diner on the absolute worst night of your life. Look at your broken, shattered pieces, and see a foundation strong enough to build an empire upon. Valerie thought she was throwing away a worthless piece of trash. She thought she was discarding a failure. But all she did was clear the path, removing her toxic weight from my shoulders, allowing me to step into my actual, boundless destiny. She handed me the exact pain I needed to become the man, the father, and the leader I was always meant to be. Today, I am the CEO of a billion-dollar trust. I am a devoted father with full, undisputed custody of 2 beautiful, happy children who will never know the feeling of being inadequate. I am a partner in a foundation that brings lost souls back to the people who never stopped loving them. And I am a man who finally, truly, and unequivocally knows his own worth. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had your worth diminished, mocked, or destroyed by the people who were supposed to love you the most, only to realize later that their cruel rejection was actually your greatest liberation? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. We are building a community of survivors here, a place where the truth comes to light, and your voice absolutely matters. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, remember, the people who tell you that you are worthless are usually just terrified of what you might accomplish once you figure out they were lying. Stay strong.